Hi everyone, today I'm going to go back and have a look at another one of my conference papers. This paper takes us back to the Australasian Transport Research Forum of 2013, and I presented this paper with a colleague of mine, Mark Best. I presented the first part of the paper, that is mostly around the theoretical side of things, and he presented the case study at the end, which was a bypass case study. So we did this as a team, so I went up and he went up after me. So the title of this paper is Dealing with Projected Capacity Constraints in Road Project Appraisal. So what is the significance of this work? When you are dealing with projects, transport projects in particular, road projects and all that, chances are that you're dealing with a problem that could very well relate to capacity. So you could have a situation where your existing infrastructure may be just about dealing with capacity at the present, but in the future it won't be able to deal with that capacity. So you've got to bear that in mind when you do the appraisal. Even with the upgrade as well. If we're looking at 20, 30 years out, the upgrade also may actually be struggling for capacity as well. So how do we deal with that? So you could be looking at different traffic volumes in both your base and project case. So it does make it a little bit complicated. And also, how do you approach that in terms of what is going to be the most realistic? So with this paper, we focused on bypass, because that is a particularly tricky one to look at, because you're looking at a new road as well as an existing road, and these roads could reach capacity at different times. Or in the sense of the base case, you don't have that other road, so you're going to get up to capacity a lot quicker. And with the project case as well, because there'll be different purposes of travel for those going on the bypass to those actually still going into town. So what we are going to be looking at is the Bruce Highway. And if you're familiar with Australia and Queensland, you know that the Bruce Highway is the main highway going north-south. So that's going from Brisbane all the way up to Cairns. And this is a very important corridor to actually for transporting freight, for peak transport as a whole. There are very few alternatives to actually going north-south, and the quality of these roads are not particularly good. And what's interesting with Bruce Highway as well, that towns, there's quite a few towns anyway, of a substantial size that actually have traffic within those towns. And you've got the through traffic going north-south, that potentially creating some congestion. And therefore, it's been, found that there's a need for bypasses in order to reduce that congestion within town. And that's why we're going to be focusing on bypasses in this presentation. So let's have a quick look at the nature of the problem. So we've got here two diagrams, and this is traffic volumes, or I think what we got here, passenger car equivalents. So how we come up with that is you'll have what we call an average annual daily traffic, and that is your numbers, absolute numbers of vehicles. But not all vehicles are of the same size, so you need to adjust them in order to get a traffic volume. For example, you may have 1,000 cars, and that would be considered equal to 1,000 passenger car equivalents. Or you may have 1,000 trucks, and that could be closer to about 4,000 or 5,000 passenger car equivalents. So it's important to actually convert that into your passenger car equivalents or passenger car units, so you can actually come up with a volume, and then that volume can then be compared with the capacity of the road. So we call that the volume capacity ratio. And once the ratio reaches a certain number, congestion starts to set in. So that varies a little bit from road to road. Once you get up to, I think, a volume capacity ratio of about 0.7, vehicles start to slow down. And then once you get above 1, that's when it hits pretty hard, and you start getting that quite serious congestion until you reach, I think it's a volume capacity ratio of 1.25. And that's where we assume that you can't get any more vehicles on the road. So it's starting to look a little bit more like a car park. So these two diagrams here, you can see in the first one, which is your base case, that your traffic volume is getting up to that volume capacity ratio of about 1.25 in around year 13. So this is what we've shown here, that you can't get any more additional vehicles on the road, so your growth would be flatlined in reality. But whereas in your project case, you continue to add more vehicles because we've got that extra capacity and it can cater for those vehicles. But that makes our analysis a little bit challenging if we're dealing with different numbers. And as we'll see in the next few slides, we come up with a number of solutions and how that can be approached. So here are 5 solutions that we discussed in the paper. First one is perfect information. Second is unconstrained traffic growth. Third is additional capacity. Fourth is shortened evaluation period. And the fifth one is limiting traffic growth to volume capacity ratio. So the first scenario would be nice if we had perfect information, if we knew exactly what was going to happen. But unfortunately, with any analysis, you're looking into the future and you won't have perfect information. I guess the best case scenario is you can look at trends from the past and you may have some information of where you may have some future growth. So you can put that into an analysis to have some idea of what's going to happen. But there are so many unknowns that perfect information is going to be very difficult. And with unconstrained traffic growth, again, that is a very quick way of going about it. We just assume traffic growth grows out of proportion, discuss that later on. Additional capacity, that is assuming that you're going to have some infrastructure built in your base case to deal with that, though not to the extent of your project case. Shortened evaluation period, this is just shortened evaluation period to when you figure that there's too many unknowns to actually make any projections, so you want to play it safe and just cut it right there. Again, that has its risk in the sense that how short are you going to cut it and when would you cut it? And the last one is limiting growth to the volume capacity ratio. So that means once it gets to that projected VCR of 1.25, we just restrict growth and all that. But that also has some complications too. So now let's take a look at perfect information. Okay, as I mentioned before, in reality that's almost impossible, but we can get something that may be considered fairly close to perfect information, if you want to call it that, which would involve a lot of research, a lot of information, and would be highly data intensive to get us in a scenario where we feel confident that what we're projecting forward is actually going to be accurate. And unfortunately, you look back in history, a lot of research and stuff has been done and things just change. So I don't entirely feel comfortable with going through this, we call it perfect information scenario, but perfect, I guess, best information or most invested into getting the most accurate information scenario. Because it's not just the section that you're looking at, but you've got to have a look at the whole network. Because you're making a change here, and there's going to be changes in other parts of the network, which is inevitable. And that needs to be known in order to make projections for this particular part of the network. And also about timings of various things. You need to know the timings of a project. You need to know the timings of any expansions, or even within your own project as well. So it requires a lot of information, and it's quite difficult. And you're looking at, in terms of like elasticity demand would be a good example. Like if you're going to upgrade this section of the road, how many vehicles are going to switch from other parts of the network to this part of the network? Or how many vehicles or how many users are going to decide, hey, we'll travel between 9 a.m. and 10 a.m. now instead of 11 and 12 because of the change in the network and how behavior changes. So you get issues of generated traffic and induced traffic. So it can get very, very complicated. So this is something I would probably not recommend. You think the perfect information scenario is great. It generally just isn't possible. And even with a large investment in research to get the most accurate information, it just takes one or two things to be out and your analysis could still be very, very inaccurate. So I'm going to recommend adopting a different approach to this. The next approach I want to take a look at is additional capital. So what do I mean by that? So you have your base case, which you take it as a business as usual, or I guess most realistic scenario if there isn't any, if the project doesn't go ahead. Then you've got your project case, which is simply your project goes ahead and any projections that go with that. So we're talking about additional capital is that we're figuring that something needs to be done and additional capital will have to be spent. So this comes down to deciding what that additional capital is going to be, the extent of that capital, and also the timing of that. If, for example, your base case is simply just your project case 5 years out, then effectively you're not actually really evaluating the project because the difference between your costs in the base and project case is going to be very small. So it has to be something that's significantly less capital intensive, significantly less costly, but at the same time resolves the problem to a certain extent, and it's to know what that is and when to apply it. And often cases, it's almost impossible to do that. You can have a crack at it in terms of looking at it. It's like when your volume capacity ratio gets up to that 1.25 again, and then place the investment in there. But there's a lot of other things that come into play as well. And also the availability of capital, where other money's going in, and also as well different projects, the interaction between them. So it is a very difficult one to call. So in most cases, again, I probably wouldn't recommend the solution unless you actually have some really good information around when you're going to have this alternative investment and how it's going to go about. Otherwise, probably look at a different scenario to try and get a more accurate analysis. So I'm going to look at the next three solutions within this one slide here, because I think there's certain similarities between them, and it's actually good to compare, to see those similarities and also see the differences between what we're doing. So if we look at unconstrained traffic growth, so that is, you can see here in the top diagram with the top straight line there, this linear line just continuously going up. So that's assuming that in the base case, traffic is just going to keep on increasing and increasing and increasing, unrestricted. So what happens there is you're going to get a situation where if you're still using your volume capacity ratio to a certain speed, you're going to reach queuing speed in a particular year. I think we've got here that is year 13. And then for the remaining 21 years, all vehicles in the base case are going to be traveling at that very slow speed. And then eventually as well, you get the project case, which I think was a little bit later actually. So I think that was year 13 for the project case, and it's actually year 6 for the base case. So in year 6 in the base case, it's going to reach capacity. So for those years 6 to 13, and we're talking about 7 years on, you're going to have vehicles moving at queuing speed, while you've got vehicles moving a lot faster in your project case. But after year 13, you're going to have the next 21 years, both your base case and your project case, vehicles moving at that queuing speed. So you're going to have a scenario that's going to be very unrealistic, and the costs are going to be absolutely enormous in both the base and the project case. So it's a little difficult to determine what your benefit cost ratio is going to be out of that. We'll see a little bit later how that pans out, but it's going to be very interesting in the sense you've got such high costs and you're modeling something that is basically totally unrealistic. So what have we got now? We're going to have a look at limiting traffic growth to the volume capacity ratio. So what you have a base case scenario which reaches year 6 and then it gets capped. So no more vehicles can go on the road. And then in year 13, it gets capped. So you're looking at a situation from year 13 onwards. We're not having additional vehicles, but vehicles are still moving at the queuing speed. But the key difference between that and the unconstrained growth, just letting it go out of control, you're going to have, let's say, I don't know, 40,000 vehicles sort of gridlocked, compared to if you use unconstrained, you could have like 200,000 vehicles, which is completely unrealistic because it can't even fit on the road. But even this scenario, with limiting it to your volume capacity ratio, it's still going to be unrealistic because you're going to have a parking lot for the next 20 years if you're looking at the valuation period for both cases, even though realistically you can get those number of vehicles on the road. But to say that there's going to be nothing occurring during that time, no additional capital expenditure or anything along those lines, is quite unrealistic. Now we've got this shortened evaluation period. And that one is interesting in the sense that we're not going to worry about it once it gets beyond that. So once you get to your year 13, that's the end of your evaluation period. We're not doing a 30-year evaluation period anymore. We're doing a 13-year evaluation period. And the remainder would then be used as a residual value. So really you'd have your high benefits would be between year 6 and year 13. So you'd still have that in your base case as more or less congested, assuming that nothing much is being done in that period, which may or may not be that realistic, but it's not for such a long period of time, and we're not dragging that out for the whole 30 years. So I think, in my opinion, that this seems to be, from what we talked about so far, the more logical approach. And when you look at these graphs here as well, so you look at where we get capped and unconstrained, you've got the difference there. So it seems to be getting better. Unconstrained seems to be the worst. Limiting your traffic to volume to the volume capacity ratio is better because it can be realistic, but again, probably wouldn't be. And then shorten the evaluation period, because there's so many unknowns, we're not going to touch it and we'll use. And that will probably be the more conservative approach, and one from this point anyway seems to probably be the better approach. So I'm now going to have a quick look over the strengths and weaknesses, the pros and cons of the 5 approaches that I've discussed just now. So let's just take a look at the perfect information approach. So if everything is accurate in terms of modeling and data and all that, you should be able to produce realistic results. It also should include benefits to generated or induced traffic. And also as well, you can actually look at the network as a whole and incorporate all of those benefits to the network and all. So you can get a really, really complete picture by trying to adopt this perfect information approach. But at the same time, though, it's also got a number of weaknesses as well. And I think that's mostly around in terms of things like collecting data. You need a massive amount of data to actually adopt this approach, and you need to have very accurate data as well. And it's going to be very, very time consuming to actually collect all of that data, and also probably very expensive as well. And on top of that, once you've collected all this data, taken all that time, and you need all the time to analyze the data, you'll then have to model that data. And how would you go about doing that? It will probably require a number of different models, whether it be macro models or mesoscopic or microsim models, to actually make sense of some of that data. And then once you've actually got all those outputs, then you actually need a cost-benefit analysis model that can actually take in all those inputs and actually generate a result. So potentially this could be a very strong approach that could give you a very accurate answer, but it relies on a lot of things such as accurate data, availability of data, having the right budget, having the right models and the right tools to make it happen. So in most cases, this scenario, this approach is probably not going to happen. So next one, unconstrained traffic growth. This is very simple and very easy to understand. Just let it all grow and let traffic just grow. Minimal additional modeling is required. You don't need to go into too much detail in regards to the modeling, because simply you're not really modeling anything. You're just following historical data trends. But it has a number of very significant weaknesses. And the first one is it's totally unrealistic. Traffic isn't going to grow beyond capacity. Cars aren't going to stack themselves on top of each other. And even if they could fit on the road, you're not going to have a situation where you're going to be gridlocked for 20, 30 years. So it doesn't look at, it basically ignores what we talked about, volume capacity ratio at 1.25, and get to that point. And also it doesn't take into consideration any of the network effects whatsoever. So whatever's happening in this area, you don't know what's happening around it and assume that it almost doesn't exist. So I would say that this is probably not a good solution, not a good approach to adopt. So let's take a look at additional capital. I think this one's probably a better approach. It has its problems as well, though. But a strong strength is, again, it's quite easy and simple to understand. You get up to capacity, you make additional investments. And it is... and you can actually come up with scenarios where you won't necessarily have a situation where you've got to have, imaginary capacity to deal with the extra vehicles. You can actually come up with something that could more or less look fairly realistic. And you're doing it without the level of detail of the perfect information scenario. It also has a number of other problems as well. And that is, you're looking at stuff like what is your future base case, and when is this capacity, or when is this capital actually going to, you can say, okay, you're going to do it when your volume capacity ratio equals 1 or equals 1.25 and all that. But it may not necessarily pan out that way in terms of, will the funding be available at the time? And would it be practical as well in terms of how it fits in with other investment? And what is the extent of this investment too? You can't have a solution that's the same as your project case for just 5 years out. It has to be a simpler solution, but at the same time, it has to address the needs pointed out of the project. So it can be very difficult to come up with that. And you're not addressing a current need either, you're addressing a future need. So it can be very difficult to actually come up with that right solution. And as with the unconstrained traffic growth, again, you're not looking at the network as a whole. It's very much focused around one area. So how about we look at shortened evaluation period? Again, this is fairly simple to understand. You make the cut in the evaluation period once you reach that capacity. It doesn't require much modeling, because we're assuming that once you get to the complicated modeling, we're not going any further because we feel it's a little unreliable. So we're keeping it to the basic modeling the first years, where you actually know what that, the capacity of your project and your base case can more or less handle the traffic volumes. And it also, it can actually be combined with another approach I'm going to talk about in a minute, and that is relation to your volume capacity approach. So it gives you potential to actually merge solutions with this one. So I think that's quite a positive. But, okay, so what's the negative though? Again, this still has some weaknesses. And the problem is, if you're going to cut your evaluation period, like in this scenario we're going to talk about in a minute, it's like year 13. That is another 17 years that's not being evaluated. And it could have substantial benefits that are not being incorporated because you're cutting it that short. And with the evaluation period, again, it's a little bit subjective as well when that defined cut should be. I know we talked about at one point, was it 1.25? Again, you could cut that a little bit earlier. You could make some assumptions that, well, traffic growth isn't going to just grow linear and then just flatline. And it's complicated from that point of view. And also, you're going to be dealing with large residual values if we're talking about, last 20 years is not evaluated. And then there's a number of approaches to calculating residual values. So again, that has to be agreed upon. So it's not a straightforward solution. So let's now take a look at our final one. This is limiting traffic growth to volume capacity ratio. So this is somewhat more realistic than unconstrained growth. So we're not going to have vehicles on the road that just simply can't fit there. But we're going to have it to a point that we're cutting it so you could get those vehicles on the road. What could be considered unrealistic is that you could have prolonged periods of time where the road is going to be very congested, which in most cases, well, I think in Queensland, historically, we don't really have roads that are just congested for years on years on years on years. I'm not saying that it wouldn't happen, but it still may not be that realistic by comparison. So another advantage is that it bears more similarity to the perfect information approach in the sense that we are at least trying to model forward to a certain extent, but it's not data intensive because we're not getting every single bit of information. We rely more on the volume capacity ratio. And so you don't have to have that additional modeling, but you have something that theoretically could work. But what happens though, there's still some weaknesses as well, and it's like with all these solutions. You may end up with some unrealistic traffic growth in your project case as well, depending on how you're applying that VCR, especially in the case of a bypass, because you're looking at a bypass that you're going to reach volume capacity, you're going to reach your capacity at different stages. Like the bypass might be clear for many years before, after that you've considered the existing road to become congested. So you've got to bear that in mind as well. So when are you actually applying all these capping and all that to like the bypass situation, to the actual bypass, and when year do you apply it to your existing infrastructure? So also as well, you've got to bear in mind that there's going to be changes in behaviour as well, as one road's getting more congested than the other. Like if the bypass got more congested than existing, they'll be switching backwards and forwards. So without modelling, more detailed modelling, the extent we'll be able to pick that up is going to be quite difficult. And again, it is really relying on that solution of volume capacity ratio reaching your 1 or to your 1.25 to get us there. So, wow, okay, so it just covers very quickly on the strengths and weaknesses. So it doesn't seem like we're getting too far at the moment, but we've got a number of solutions, not a real definitive answer. But anyway, we're going to look at a case study now where we've actually looked at applying these approaches to this case study. And this was actually presented at the conference by my colleague Mark Best. So I'll try my best to cover this case study going forward from here. So just a quick recap of our proposed methodologies. So we got perfect information, unconstrained traffic growth, additional capital, shortened evaluation period, and limiting traffic growth to VCR. So with this case study, unfortunately, we weren't able to look at it in terms of perfect information. We didn't have the time or the resources to actually apply that approach. And also, we didn't touch on the additional capital approach either. So we're going to be focusing on the unconstrained traffic growth, the shortened evaluation period, as well as limiting traffic growth to volume capacity ratio. And we'll see what kind of results we're getting and sort of how realistically it actually panned out. So for this is just give you a quick idea of what project we looked at. This is a project that was up in Townsville. And this was a bypass. I think it was the 4th stage of the bypass. A bypass at Townsville. So traffic was using some of the bypass, the existing bypass, should I call it, and then finishing up going through a little bit through Townsville. This was to complete the bypass, to have a complete bypass of Townsville. So, and how these vehicles were, moving through there and how best to analyze it. So you've got to bear in mind, you've got to look at the existing network, and that will consist of are stretches of road and intersections. There were quite a number of intersections along there that require additional modelling. And also the bypass, which I think would have had an intersection at either end, but was a little bit easier to analyse. So just bear that in mind in the context of what we're doing. And Townsville is up in sort of northern Queensland, you could say. It's south of Cairns, not quite that far up, but it's within tropical Queensland anyway, and located on the Bruce Highway. So let's quickly have a look at the results for this CBA using uncapped traffic growth. So we've got our capital costs fairly high of about 150 million, and we've got discounted benefits of 63.5 million. So we've got an NPV, very low number, negative 85.9 million, and a fairly low benefit cost ratio as well. So in this case, our uncapped traffic growth is not really giving us a high value, but we've got to put this also in context of what results we're getting with some of the other projects as well. But it's like I said, if you've got a project case that's going to be at capacity after about year 13, the costs in your project case are going to be very, very high. And that could be a reason why the results here are not particularly good. But we'll take a look at the other scenarios, look at the other approaches in terms of what results we're getting out of those as well. So here we have the results of the CBA if we shortened the evaluation period to when the base case reached capacity. So that was only year 6. So in a sense, we're calculating benefits for just 6 years. And the rest of the benefits, I think, would have been calculated as a residual value. As you can see here, residual value, very high residual value of 95 million. And it's quite massive. So we're only evaluating $41 million of capital, and we're only getting $8.5 million of benefits. The benefits are very, very low. I think simply because we're just looking at so few years of analysis. And there's potentially is going to be more benefits to project case beyond that 6-year period going out to year 13. But we tried capping it here anyway after just 6 years because, again, we didn't want to deal with some of the problems in the base case in terms of how that should be treated. So, yeah, in short, you've got very, very small amount of benefits. I think a lot of benefits have not been included. So we'll probably say that this is not a very good approach to doing it, simply because the evaluation period is just way too short. So let's look at, again, capping the evaluation period, but not to the value not to the year in your base case when it hits capacity, but to your project case. So that means we'll be capping it in year 13 instead of year 6. So what difference does that make? So now we've got 13 years of benefits. So that's quite substantially more. And you can see the benefits have gone up quite considerably. They've gone up to about 41 million. So that is a lot higher than what we had before, because it's quite substantial benefits you'd be getting in that 7-year period. And also bearing in mind that your base case is going to be fairly gridlocked for that 7 years. So your costs are going to be very high. Whereas your traffic is still moving, may not be free flowing, but definitely a lot better than in the base case. So that's where you're getting a lot of benefits here. And also we've got to deal with a residual value. So we've got a residual value that's still fairly high, about 44.7 million. Of this residual values, by the way, we used just a simple straight line approach to that. We didn't come up with anything too particularly fancy with that. So it's, some could argue that potentially you could be understating the residual value as well. But the results of the CBA still indicate that BCR is very low at a 0.45, even though we've included all these additional benefits from that extra 7 years. So that gives us fairly close, I think, to what we had just now with the uncapped scenario. So let's take a look at what we do if we actually cap it and see what the results are with that. So with our cap growth scenario, you can see here that actually got the results of all of them now. So I'm going to make a comparison between the different approaches here and the results that we're getting. So with the capped approach, so you don't have to worry about residual value. We're going to go out the full 30-something years of the evaluation. That is, the 30 years of benefits plus the construction period. I can't remember what that was now. And then we've capped it using the volume capacity ratio. So in the base case, traffic does not grow beyond year 6, and in the project case, traffic volume does not grow beyond year 13. But we're still assuming that we're getting benefits for those remaining 17 years. And because of that, we actually get quite substantially higher benefits. In fact, we get more benefits than the uncapped approach, interestingly enough. I would have thought uncapped would have given you higher, But I can see in this situation that because it gets congested so quickly, that those additional costs in your project case from that whole uncapped period is probably so high that it erodes most of those later benefits anyway. Whereas it's not the case with your capped version, where those huge numbers are not going to be there in your project case. So I think it's given that just a little bit of a boost. But even then, the benefit cost ratio is still fairly low at 0.66. So again, this is not an economically viable project. And you probably encounter that many of our projects are not economically viable simply because you've got such high capital costs, and the traffic volumes are not there compared to some of the bigger cities that you may get down, in southeast Queensland, you've got Brisbane, or you have other states with Melbourne and Sydney and places like that. So it does make it difficult when you've got lower traffic volumes. But at the same time, with those lower numbers, it still certainly presents a problem. But you've got high capital costs, is generally going to not give you a particularly high benefit cost ratio. So you can see here the capped approach gives us the highest number, and that wasn't the reason why we recommended this though. We ruled out the uncapped approach because it's simply just unrealistic. And the other two, shortened evaluation periods, I think they're good approaches that can be adopted. But in this case, because we're talking about, first of all, cutting it in year 6 in the base case, looking at that, that's just, it's just too short. Too many benefits are not being included. And even year 13 is definitely better, cutting it, the evaluation period to just 13 years than to 6. But I still think we're leaving too much out there that's not covered. So personally, I would recommend going with the capped approach in this case. And I think Mark agreed as well. So we selected this, but I think it is a little bit more subjective. If, for example, benefits went out to maybe year 20 or year 23, 24, whatever, getting closer, and then maybe then cutting it there would be a little, because we really need to have something to evaluate. But that's what makes it quite difficult, isn't it? That it is a bit of a balancing act. But I think this presentation is good in the sense that we are looking at solutions to quite a problem. When you're looking at modeling, when you have differences between your base and your project case with traffic volumes and stuff, and you're looking at reasonably short-term solutions. Unfortunately, expensive short-term solutions. But in this case, you can't just assume simply, like with your uncapped approach, just everything goes as normal. We've got to find a way around that. And at the same time, you just don't want to cut it too short either. So it is a real balancing act, and I think this has been a good exercise of looking at this. But I think other areas to look at would probably be looking at alternative project cases that maybe give you a longer solution than what was presented here and what we dealt with this particular project. So this brings me to the end of this conference paper. I hope you've enjoyed it. It's been a tricky one, especially when we're looking at demand. This doesn't have to be a transport or a road project. You can apply it to any number of different types of projects. You can even look at it as a health project, for example, would be somewhat similar. This is done as part of a transport conference paper. But take, for example, a hospital. You're projecting certain growth in number of patients, and simply the hospital can't handle that in a few years' time. And even with an upgrade, it may only be able to handle it for maybe another 6 or 7 years' time. You still come to the issue of what's going to happen with those patients. So I think what we've covered today doesn't have to just cover off on transport or roads in particular, but I think it can cover off more broadly in the CBA context anyway. And also as well, that you've got to bear in mind there isn't really one fixed solution. I could say the perfect information approach, which we didn't touch on, could very well be the best approach if your information, quality information, really is that good. Then again, though, if the quality information isn't really there, it's probably going to come down to the two scenarios, the two approaches that we talked about, and that is shortening the evaluation period to what you're more comfortable with, or applying constraints and all to your demand side, which is what we talked about with the volume capacity constraint approach. So there's not one solution that fits all. I think you really got to bear in mind all the various factors that are involved, and which is going to be your most appropriate solution. And I hope this paper can be used, and this video can be used as a form of guidance when you're analyzing particular projects about what approach to adopt, especially with these capacity ones that we're talking about. reaching capacity before the end of the evaluation period, whether it be in the base or the project case. It gets particularly more complicated if you reach it in your project case as well. Whereas if you just reach it in your base case, adopting your volume capacity approach is probably going to be the strongest solution on that side of things anyway. And also, you've got to bear in mind that we didn't talk about in the example is additional capital. You have a lot better information. That could also possibly be a better solution as well. But anyway, well, thank you, and I'll have a few more presentations to go with my videos. But I hope you enjoyed it.
If you like today's video presentation, just click the like button and the subscribe button, and I'll be uploading several more videos in the weeks to come. Again, within the same series, videos relating to the transport conferences, as well as several other videos also relating to economics. If you want to find out more about today's paper, just go to my website at spectrumecons.com and you go to the research paper, just click the link there and you'll get the paper in full. Again, thank you for listening. Goodbye.